Greetings, brothers and sisters in Christ. It's good to have you back for another James video Bible study. And so for this time of Lent, we're going to be working through the book of James, both in my sermons and then also in this video Bible study. We left off, there's two videos prior to this one. The first one is sort of an introduction to the book of James. And we talked a little bit about historical background, authorship, different things of that nature. And then the second video was verses 1 to 8. And so now we're going to do 9 through 18. So this will be the second half of the first Sunday in Lent's sermon text. So if you go to, what was yesterday, the 26th. So the first Sunday in Lent, February 26th, I preached on verses 1 through 18. And with this main focus being verse 12, which we'll talk about a bit today. And I kind of went up to about 15. I didn't hit 16, 17, 18 very much in my sermon. And so that's just the nature of having longer chunks of text. Some pieces of the text don't quite get mentioned as much as they could be. So let's go ahead and jump right into verses 9 through 18. So we left off verses 1 to 8. You can see this talking about being double-minded and unstable. And we're talking about how that plays a role with doubt and prayer. But the conversation continues then in verse 9. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flower falls, and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of firstfruits of his creatures. So there's the text we're going to look at, and I'm going to turn myself on here in the corner. And so looking at verse 9 to 11, sometimes some of the commentators will make this sort of its own little section. I think it's all connected, which is, some other commentators think that too. It's not just me. But here we get sort of the first foray into rich and poor. James will come back to this theme a couple different times. And so he's going to compare the lowly and the rich. And then he's going to cite, so this, like a flower of the grass, scorching it, wither, flower falls, and beauty perishes. That's a quote from the Old Testament. And so he's using this Old Testament quote to compare between the lowly and the rich, and that the rich are like the flower. In the Old Testament citation, it's people. And so here we're making a contrast between the lowly brother boasting in his exaltation and the rich in his humiliation. So the rich will be humiliated, and the lowly will be exalted and have reason to boast. And most of the commentators I read talk about how this is against the rich, and so we have to decide who the rich are. Now, I was reading something else today. I think it was maybe the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Mound from Matthew or Luke, and I can't remember now, because the thought just occurred to me that the rich have a tendency to oppress. So maybe it was James. I was reading through James too, more than just these verses here. But the rich who oppress might be the way to understand this use of the word rich. because in the use of the word rich here, they will be humiliated. They are against the lowly. And so this, the thought is, these rich must not be believers, but outside persecutors. So the rich are the wealthy of the communities that these Christians who have fled Jerusalem are now being oppressed by. And so the thought here is that in verse 9, the rich are referring to rich unbelievers who use their wealth to oppress and to cause injustice in the life of Christians, or at least in the Jewish Christians' audience that he's speaking to. And so for those of us who have money or who are considered wealthy, certainly by worldly standards, which would be all of us, by the way, we as Americans live in the top 1% of the world. There's nobody who makes minimum wage who's not in the 1% of the world. So Americans in general can be considered rich on a global scale. Now, obviously, when we talk about community, there is different tiers and different classes and different people who have more wealth than others in communities. And because all politics is local, that wealth or that status can be used to oppress people in your community. It can be used for influence, it can be used for status, it can be used for power, it can be used for corruption. So though in the world stage all Americans are rich, that doesn't mean that all Americans aren't oppressed. And so when we can think about it in two ways. One, this text should reflect on those of us who live comfortably as Americans, and then it should also allow us to reflect on the local community as well, and those dynamics of the community having different strata, different people of different economic classes. So we can't just assume rich, bad people over there that's not us. We can be quick to do that, and that's not really the right thing to do. We need to reflect on our status both as in the world and as our community so that we rightfully reflect on both the warnings and the encouragement. So that's important to keep in mind. We can't just live in the shoes of the good guys all the time. Otherwise, James doesn't really make any sense to us. So there's that way of looking at it and seeing the rich as the bad guys. However, as I was giving this verse thought, I don't think you have to say that the lowly and the rich are both, one are Christians and one are not, right? So the lowly brother is the faithful one and the rich are the unfaithful one. I don't think you have to do that to have this text make sense, because what we find, the Christian wealthy, so the rich who are believers, will humiliate themselves in their Christian lives in the same way that the lowly are exalted. And they will, both in the community of believers, so in the church, right? So the wealthy in the church are giving of their wealth to support the ministry, to support the lowly, to support the widow and the orphan. And so they are, by association, by community association, who we associate with, the status might be lowered, as we see Jesus sort of have this problem in the community where, as a well-respected rabbi, he's not supposed to go have dinner with sinners, tax collectors, prostitutes. These aren't the people he's supposed to associate with. And so this association could cause humiliation, depending on sort of that local status again, sort of talking locally here. But also when we're talking about the last day, they too will be brought down. And that doesn't necessarily mean judgment, but sort of brought down into sort of equal standing, because that's what we see with Christ, is that there is this equality amongst those, in the sense that those status symbols don't count for anything when we get to the last day. And so that's true both of the rich and of the poor, because there's plenty of poor without faith, and there's plenty of rich with faith. And so the lowly believer will be exalted and sort of to this higher status, but the rich will also be brought down to the status of the poor. And so it's a leveling in which one is brought up and one is brought down. And so I think we can see the text kind of that way, in which we don't have to necessarily we don't have to necessarily make the rich the bad guys. And so that's one of the things we don't have any textual evidence to say that the rich here are unbelievers, except that James is sort of speaking in their humiliation. So when we look at this humiliation and then what follows, as I said, this is an Old Testament quotation that in general speaks generally of people. People wither and the grass fades, and it's like the people of Israel are doing that. And so I see verse 10b to 11 as a universal truth about people and the last day, that all will fall, all flowers fall, all beauty perishes, all status is wiped out in that sense, and so it's taken out. And so, yes, the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. So I think that's, if we say all of this, so all of 10, 11, and here is all talking about just the rich, then we're only saying that the lowly brothers brought up an exaltation, and that's all this is about, and everything else is about rich people getting what's coming to them. And I don't think, because the Old Testament reference doesn't necessarily go that route, that I don't think James would use it in that drastically different of a way. And so if this is universal, then we can sort of understand one's being brought up, one's being brought down, and then when we get to the end of 11, so also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. This fading away, I think, comes back in, let's see, does it use that same verb? No, but I mean, the idea is there, right? So the passing away, flower falls, withers, and now the rich man's fading. I think if you want to keep this universal, which you don't have to, you can make the rich the bad guy. But I think if you're going to push it universally, what you're saying is his pursuits, his wealth will not keep him from fading away, which we know is true. You can have all the money in the world and the best doctors in the world, and you'll still die. Your wealth won't keep you alive. And so even in the midst of your pursuits, in the midst of your wealth, that's not going to keep you from fading away. That's not going to keep you from having the flower fall and the grass wither from the scorching heat that is judgment and death. So in a sense, if I was to take 9 to 11 as a sort of a teaching unit, I would say about it that all will die, the lowly will be brought up, the rich will be brought down before God, because all sort of come to Christ in humility and faith when time of judgment or time of death comes to them, and there's nothing, not even the pursuits, the riches, the resources of the wealthy will save them from this fading away, which I think we understand as truth. If you want to make the rich the bad guy, then you see this verse as the poor who are faithful will be exalted, the rich, the oppressors, those who are unjust, they will fall under the scorching heat of the sun of judgment, and they will wither, and they will fall, and they will fade away in the midst of their pursuits, and their pursuits are evil. And so you can kind of go that route. But when I don't necessarily like that interpretation, because of there's just no textual thing that makes the rich bad guys or unbelievers here. There will come a point in which, I think later on in the chapter, when they're talking about the rich who are oppressing, then there's a rebuke. At this point, there isn't that necessarily that rebuke going on here. So that's what I have about those verses. When we look at verse 12 was the sermon text for Sunday. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Here, I thought this was kind of the central idea of what came before and what came after, because we're talking about trials, temptation. So this whole section is trials and temptations, and how do we understand trials? How do we understand suffering? Whether there's steadfastness that is flowing out of it. And so this sort of became that summary statement in which, how do we face trials? Well, remember at the end of these trials comes the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. And so those who love him will look to him, or have faith in him and not doubt in his providential care. And so that love for him comes from his actions for us and trusting in him. And so when we deal with trials and suffering, then those trials and sufferings point out our weaknesses, and we have then two options from that weakness. We can either dive into that weakness, which we're going to talk about in 13 to 15, or we can look to the one who loves us first, who cares for us, who promises us, and we find endurance in that strengthening that comes from the Lord, that wisdom that we pray for to deal with the trial and the suffering. And then the result of that endurance, that steadfastness, results in finishing the race and receiving the crown of life, which I talked about in the sermon as well. That crown, you don't want to think medieval crowns, or the British crown where you have a gold crown and there's lots of jewels and it's for royalty. The crown of life is an athlete's crown. It's the crown of garland. So it's a wreath on the head of a vine or garland, and it's sort of this green full of life sort of idea, and that's sort of a symbol of vitality, of health, of success, and of victory. So when we think about crown of life, think first more life than British crown. We're thinking garland, green, symbols of life, vitality, not necessarily jewels and riches. Jewels and riches is an idea we get from the crown of royalty, not the athlete's crown. And so it would be more like the marathoner's medal. So if you've ever ran a marathon or seen people who run marathons, everyone who finishes a marathon gets a marathon medal. Because, obviously, someone who gets first place or second place or third place gets a big trophy, but everyone who completes a marathon gets a medal, usually wrapped around their neck, right? So I have a marathon medal. It's very fancy. My dad has his framed. And so when you have that marathon medal, it's because you've completed it. It's a sign of completion of something difficult. It's the reward at the end. It is, in a sense, a crown of life, but it's not worn on the head. So that's one idea there, just to keep that in mind of what James is talking about, and how thinking about the trophy at the end helps through the struggles, which happens, whenever we deal with hardship and struggle and sort of that going through hard times. The thing that helps us get through is, one, knowing that there is an end, which is a promise of God, that evil doesn't rule the day, and it always comes to an end, no matter how great the evil is. Two, we think about the reward at the end. So we don't just think of, the evil's coming to an end, but that we are then better for it, or are rewarded for it. Whether it be the marathoner's medal, whether it be the crown garland, whether it be, you get to sit in a chair and relax, or you get to go get a donut after a run, whatever the reward might be, we think about the reward when we begin to struggle. And so that idea also kind of comes along with the trials as well. Now, I talked about, so moving then back into the text here, I talked about how there becomes two options, that you can either go one, I'm on the eraser. I'm going to switch over here because I'm doing something different. You can go one way or the other. One goes to life. I'm using a crayon. I didn't mean to. And one then goes to evil or to death. And this actually ties in a little bit with that Deuteronomy text I preached a little bit, or a little further back, in which I put before you two options. You can choose life or choose death, and the sort of idea of two ways, which is characteristic both in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and early Christian literature. So we find that in the Didache and the letter of Barnabas, and in other places as well, or the Epistle of Barnabas is what it's called. Both, it doesn't matter. So you've got those, that tradition sort of thing. And so James is, in a sense, he's not saying it directly, but that sort of is somewhat of the implicit theology going on here. And so that, because we find in 13, let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. And so that temptation is not from God, because we're not supposed to say it's from God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. So it's outside of his character to be tempted by evil. That's sort of what we're saying here, and what James is saying here. For God cannot be tempted with evil. God isn't tempted because there is no evil in him. Therefore, he can't be the source of that evil. That's why he can't tempt. He himself tempts no one, because that'd be outside of his character. And so when we think for God cannot be tempted with evil, that is a character statement. And that's important because when we think about his character, God's character, and we think about his will, as we're going to talk about here at the end in verse 18, what is God's will? What does he desire? What is he like? What does he want? Well, it's not temptation and falling away from him. That doesn't make any sense. God doesn't want people, his creation, whom he loves, whom he sent his son to die for, to then fall away from him. No, he wants them to be with him. He's not trying to push us away. He's not trying to punish us so that we fall away from faith and begin to doubt our faith. No, none of those things are of God. So where are those things from then? Well, each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Oh, it's from me that the temptation comes, because I want something other than God. That's what lures me away. That's what entices me away. It's my own desire, the things I want that I think I can then get a hold of in this time of weakness. And so when we think about what is luring and enticing us, we have to recognize that it is us. It's me. It's the things I want. Yes, we say often that it's when we talk about temptation, Luther talks about the flesh, the world, and the devil, right? These are the sources of temptation in our lives, and which is true. Satan will try and tempt us. He'll try and push us away from God. The world certainly tries to push us away from God, and then our own sinful flesh does. But we have the Holy Spirit of righteousness, and so we're able to fight against that, and we have strength to fight against temptation, and we have the Spirit, and the Holy Spirit drives us to God if we so let him, if we listen. And push away our desires and not take the bait. And so I had mentioned in the sermon, and I'll mention again now, that this idea of lured and enticed is fishing language. So James is intentionally using fishing language here, that there is a lure with bait and that they're enticed and then taken. And so he starts with fishing language in 14, and then in 15 he goes to that conception language of giving birth, birth growing, maturing, bringing forth death. And so he connects our sinful desire, our own desire, here in 15, then to death at the end of 15. So the desire, when it has conceived, which is an interesting way of thinking that, you can have desire, but desire can conceive when given the power to. And so us plus our desire can create sin, which is an interesting concept, because by ourselves we don't create sin. It's when it's us plus our desire. And then that combination brings forth sin, which then can mature if we let it, and then turn into death, which is an interesting way of thinking about our sin and the way that things within us work, that we feed sin. We're letting it mature. We're letting it grow. We're letting it get to the point where it's going to lead to death. It's not going to just sprout up miraculously. It has to be fed in the same way that our spiritual life has to be fed and grows and matures from infant to maturity, right? Taking milk and solid food. The same is true of sin here in James, that he sees that the sin the desire can conceive with our own intent, our own choices, and then we then feed that sin that begins to grow, mature, and then leads to death. And so when we talk about and think about the role of sin and how that, when we think about the role of sin in our lives and whether or not things, well, okay, I'll back up for a second because I jumped ahead of myself here. I have often heard it said, oh, it won't hurt to do X, Y, or Z, right? So, somebody's counseling or somebody wants to do something, and it's like, well, it's not going to be the end of the world if we do that. It's not going to be the end of the world if I do this thing or that thing, or the walls aren't going to cave in on us. True, they probably won't. But do you want to give birth to a sin? Do you want to feed that sin? Right? So it's not as if, oh, we got baptized as a child and then I was fed in the faith and matured, and then it just all fell apart. No, this doesn't happen instantaneously, and it doesn't happen just with one sin. It's how do we feed the sin? How are we continually feeding the sin? And how much have we grown to love the sin that we have nurtured, right? And so when we think about the sin in our own lives, the sin that's hard to shake, the stuff that's matured over the years, and that we have, in a sense, grown attached to, we have to recognize that, hey, this has started with desire that led to sin, that has now grown through my own volition, through my own choices. And if I'm not careful, this will lead to death. And so there needs to be a starvation of that sin, right? You do something about that. And it's all within us. It's not as if God's feeding the sin. God's not feeding the sin. You're feeding the sin. And if you're not careful, it will certainly lead to death. You know, in a sense, skipping a Sunday of church isn't going to lead to death, but is that going to create it? You know, you take your fleshly desire to, I need to sleep in, or I just didn't want to go this week, and then you allow it to grow and feed. And I mean, this is what we kind of saw in COVID. All of a sudden, we had this opportunity that wasn't born out of a sinful desire. It was a desire to serve our neighbor, but yet that then grew a pattern, and that pattern was allowed to grow and allowed to mature. And all of a sudden, in every congregation, 20% of the regular attenders disappeared, if not more than that. Where did all these people go? Well, in that year and a half, 2 years, that sin matured to the point where they didn't need church anymore. They had got, it's not just, you see it in the Christmas and Easter group that they disappeared, and that the once-a-monthers became once every 2 years, and the twice-a-monthers became once-a-monthers, and there's just sort of this decline of regular attendance. How did that happen? Well, we gave opportunity to something that then had a chance to mature and to grow. So don't be deceived, my beloved brothers. Don't blame God. Don't be deceived. Don't be deceived about what? Don't be deceived about who God is and what he wants. God doesn't desire us to have death fully formed. He doesn't will for us to have our desire rule over us. Instead, he is a giver of every good gift. Oh, I'm writing on screens you can't see. So don't be deceived. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, which is a creation reference, which comes back again in a second, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. In other words, God is not fickle. That's what I would take. So no variation or shadow of change. This isn't like God can't change his mind, God doesn't answer prayers, sort of Nakam and the Nifal sort of idea here. That's not what's going on here. What's going on here is that God is consistent in his nature. Going back to that, what is God's character sort of idea, that God promises to those who love him. Those are that's his will. His will is one in which he gives good gifts. Every perfect gift is from him. Every good thing in our lives is from him. And there's no variation or shadow due to change. He's consistent in that nature. That's what he is about. And so thinking about shadow due to change, I was talking to the LWML this afternoon about this idea that you go out into our parking lot and the shadow of the building changes. And so some places, as the sun comes up, it starts to see sunlight and the shadow shrinks, but there's always sort of this little shadow in front of door A, and so there's always sort of snow and ice that's possible there during the winter. And so, when shadows shrink and move throughout the day, and that's sort of what this idea is sort of conveying, that God isn't one of those things that, depending on the time of day, he's in a different place, and that if it's at noon, he's this way, or if he's at 1 o'clock, it's this way, or if it's in the evening, it's this way. No, it's God's not there's no variation of truth. There's no variation or shadow due to any sort of change in him. He is of one one type, one character, one will. And of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. So of his own will, what does he will? What does God want? And what does he act for? We say, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. What will does he have? Well, his will is to bring us forth by the word of truth. So in other words, the proclamation of the gospel, he wants that to go forth and to create more people for him who love him, who understand his grace and his mercy and his compassion. This is the thing that he wants. He wants people to come to him and to find the love that he has for them in his Son, Jesus Christ, the word of truth that is then proclaimed. And when that happens and that transformation occurs, then we become a first fruit of his creatures. Now, what's interesting there is the of his creatures part. Not of his people, but of his creatures. And so I said a second ago, the Father of lights idea here in verse 17 is connected to a creation idea, and then we have of his creatures. And so what I'm thinking here is that the Father of lights points to the creator of the heavens and the earth, the stars and the lights in the heavens, is sort of a creation narrative, that every good thing comes from the creator of the heavens and the earth, and that when he restores us through Christ, when he brings renewal to our lives through the word of truth, that he brings us by his will into the church, begins to make us the bride of Christ, the people of God, his children, his sons and daughters, that we are restored and made new, and our hearts are created new by the Holy Spirit. We're being sanctified, and we become these first fruits of what is to come for all of creation, first fruits of his creatures. And his creatures entail all of creation. And if they entail all of creation, then that entails the whole world. And so we're now looking forward and seeing that the restoration that we have in Christ is a foretaste of the renewal that all of creation will enjoy on the last day in the new heavens and new earth, when God redoes or remakes and restores and renews all of creation, because we know from Romans and Paul that the earth is groaning in these birth pains, waiting for us to have this last day moment so sin can be cast out of the world, because we as sinners our first father and mother brought sin into the world, and with sin came death, and with that sin and death then invaded the entirety of creation. And so all of creation is waiting for us, waiting for God to restore us and then restore them. And so we, as the people of God, are the first fruits of that restoration to the whole world. And so I think there's a lot of depth there in these last couple of verses that I didn't get to in the sermon because I wanted to focus in on trials. And I alluded to a little bit of it, of the word of truth bringing us in, and that being Christ. But for the most part, the end time reality that this verse is talking about, and this sort of hope for all creation, isn't an idea that I brought into the sermon because I had 18 verses and I had to focus in on, and I focused in on 12 and the themes coming out of that. So that is 9 to 18. I plan to do 19 to 27. That will be both the sermon text for this coming Wednesday. So for midweek services, we're going to be looking at 19 to 27, and then I'll also get a video on that done probably sometime this week, either Tuesday or Thursday or whenever I get it done. I don't know when at the moment. So that's James 1, 9 to 18, and I will see you next time for our next James Bible study. Have a great rest of your week.